Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number, I think it's 29, of All About Nothing. I'm back from our trip to UK, and the weather in the UK prepared me for what it was going to be like back home. It's now kind of gray and cloudy and rainy the way it was in London, so I feel kind of prepared for the fall moving into winter days, which have never been my favorite. Today in the San Francisco Bay Area, USA, it is Indigenous Peoples Day. It used to be called Columbus Day, but at least locally, they changed it because the idea of celebrating Columbus, who came over as a colonial imperialist who kind of stole the land from the people who lived here, no longer seemed like what we wanted to celebrate, at least in this part of the world. And interestingly, Indigenous people have been very much on my mind, especially the last few days. So I wanted to talk about some things that have been rolling around in my head since the other day when I did a webinar. And interestingly, in the Q&A, some of the people that participated, I was pleased to see, were Indigenous people from Canada, which, I was pleased that we're sort of reaching a population that I wasn't sure that we were reaching, and certainly one that in this country, in the US, has been so desperately mistreated that I feel a strong sort of kindredness and obligation to really honor them. So I was pleased that there was someone in the group who, in the question and answer period, identified herself as an Indigenous person from Canada, and I was pleased to meet her. And in a little bit of back and forth that we had before she asked her question, which was not about that, um, I was just mentioning to her that one of my sort of heroic icon figures um, was someone in my youth who I at least thought of as an Indigenous Canadian person until I spoke with her. And I found out that unbeknownst to me, and many of you probably know this already, some of the people I've talked to have known this, but I didn't, that there's been a whole movement of people called pretendians. And these were people who were not really Indigenous, but sort of feigned an Indigenous identity and then put themselves out in the world as if they were Indigenous people, which I'd never heard of this. And I was sort of appalled, not only because the true Indigenous people have been so exploited for centuries, certainly in this continent, but also that to further exploit them by pretending to be of them seemed to me like insult to injury. So I was shocked and upset to hear this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my sort of soul journey of the last few days around these issues because it sort of highlighted some neglect issues which I wanted to name. And I want to emphasize and underline that I am by no means speaking to the veracity, who's right, who's wrong, who's telling the truth, who's lying, but rather to talk about some of the neglect issues. So, all that being said, and I'm certainly open to whatever feedback I might get, um, couple of things. One of them is, as a child of neglect, many of us, because we lack a sort of a kindred group, a group that we feel identified with, many of us are searching for an identity that we can attach ourselves to, a group that I can belong to, a group that I can at least imagine or pretend that I'm part of something. And in order to resolve the dilemma without solution, which is the desperate fear of dependency, because the fear of loss and abandonment feels so just life-threatening, to attach ourselves to a group that we don't know, that's sort of out there in the world, that's sort of um, inaccessible in real life, is a safe way to be a part of something or to imagine that I'm a part of something. And I'm no exception to this. So I would sort of grab on and adhere to groupings or people that I could somehow identify with and imagine myself as being connected with and being a part of, and be relatively safe and not quite as alone. So that's one piece. Another piece is certainly for me and for many of us being a helper, being an altruistic sort of do good kind of person that will give me value, that will give me a sense of self-worth, was always a quest of mine because I felt so worthless. I felt so without existence and without any sort of redeeming qualities or any value that I could sort of point to. So attaching myself to sort of heroic, big name figures was a way that I could feel like I was a part of something larger that was doing something good in the world. Now, I came up in the 1960s, which certainly in the US was a time of protest, a time of liberation of different groups, and a time of, wonderful music, which I'm so fond of. And one of my icon figures, all those years, and you've seen me feature some of her songs over the years, was Buffy Saint Marie, who was a voice of the Indigenous people. She identified herself as a Cree Indian from Canada, and I always believed that until last Friday. And so I was very compelled by her and by her music, which was, strong, powerful protest music that I really loved. And some of the lyrics were so powerful and so strong and so compelling that I collected all of her albums. And I iconized her, idealized her, which is another one of my points. Lacking for parents that we can really feel are proud of us, that we can be sort of unambivalently proud of them. Um, I idealized her the way I idealized many people in those days, and I still struggle with that because we all want a sort of a powerful, attractive, loving, charismatic parent that we can feel sort of unambiguous about. And I certainly felt that way about her, the way I did about many musical figures. So I find out then last Friday that Buffy Saint Marie was not who she said she was. She was one of these pretendian, these native people that were not really native people, that were pretending to be native people, that were making a name for themselves and a persona of themselves and benefiting and making money and making sort of notoriety for themselves as someone that they weren't, which stunned me. I was so disappointed. And has often happened to me when I find out that some of my great heroes have feet of clay, so to speak. I was crushed. And this woman who told me this on the in the webinar last week, she said she would send me some materials where I could find out more about this. And I thought, okay. And meanwhile, I didn't want to wait, so I went online and I looked for information about Pretendians and about Buffy Saint Marie. And sure enough, I found a 45-minute documentary about Buffy Saint Marie, Pretendian, and it was from Canadian Public Broadcasting. So it was, I trusted it. And so I watched this video, and it was so sad to me watching this sort of illusion of mine dissolve before my very eyes. And it kind of reminded me of the of the Bermuda Triangle, which many of us struggle with, which is we're struggling with conflicting feelings about the same person, because many of us feel that same kind of ambivalence about those who neglected and abused us, that we admire them and that we strive in some ways even to be like them. And then on the other hand, they have these sort of despicable qualities that we don't quite want to acknowledge, but that are horrifying and infuriating and and disgusting, if you will, and shocking. And somehow we're trying to hold these different feelings together, as well as the grief about who they really are. And so I found myself feeling that way as I watched this video that was so sad, because this illusion was dissolving right before my eyes. And I remembered this long, powerful song by Buffy Saint Marie, which was called "My Country, 'Tis of Thy People You're Dying." And it was so powerful, and it was so rageful, and it was a very long song. And I remember listening to that song and feeling the same kind of horror and shame and wanting to disavow my own sort of native, my native born in the USA identity, because I didn't want in any way to be identified with that kind of perpetration that my sort of ancestral, not my own race, but my own, at least the people from the country where I live, and has always been the country of my birth since I was born, even though my identity is less about American than other things that I feel are my identity. Still, I felt that same kind of confusion that we feel in the Bermuda Triangle: the grief, the rage, the guilt, the shame, the sort of the feeling like I had egg on my face for believing the illusion that she put out in the world, which I did. And I was still struggling, even as I watched this video. And I was looking at her with this family that she had always described as her adoptive family. And they were denying that she was adopted, that they showed the birth records in the town in Massachusetts where she was born, from the hospital, and how she was categorically born to that USA family, that she was not native. And I looked at the sister and the brother, and they looked so blonde compared to her. And that was where my denial kept creeping in, like, are you sure? She looks so native compared to you looking so Aryan. and they were so angry. And then there was a part that really confused me because part of her story was that she had been sexually abused by this brother who was also in the documentary, who was interviewed, and he was also very angry and really speaking very strongly about how she was born into that family and she was a biological sister and it was all untrue, as was the sexual abuse. And then I started thinking about the confusion of memory and the confusion of identity and the various different meanings of dissociation, which has to do both with fragmentation and also confusion of memory and awareness and the blurring of memory and even knowing what's real and what isn't real. And I started feeling myself kind of washed over by some of those feelings and feeling a little bit confused about reality and remembering the false memory movement of the early 2000s in this country, where people who talked about sexual abuse were villainized and were told that their story is untrue. And so people like us who have a history where there's trauma and sexual trauma are being told that we're lying and that we're sort of subject to some kind of false memory syndrome. And I wondered if some of that was being, sort of cast onto Buffy Saint Marie, except that I believe this woman who spoke on the webinar because she herself was of that tribe that Buffy claimed to be part of it, and she was really insulted and ashamed and in her own grief and shock and anger and whatever her mix of feelings was about this confusion. So why am I telling you all this? I guess I'm telling you all this because here it is, Indigenous People Day, and I want to honor the Indigenous people with authenticity, with truth, with true, benign, very good, will and wish to include and equalize and repair and create an equal playing field for all people in my country, in our continent, in the whole world. And there's so much confusion and so much flux going on and so much sort of crisis about reality and jockeying for power and notoriety and wealth and fame and a good name. And I want everyone to be equal and included, all of us. So, all of that being said, I wanted to normalize the confusion that we have when we idealize, try to belong, and when our hero figures disappoint, or there's a confusion or a contradiction in how we feel about our heroes. I hope I'm not confusing the issues more. I've got so much that's roiling around in my head, and I'm hoping to hear more from this person who spoke on the webinar. I'm hoping she will send me more information because I want to know more. And meanwhile, I'm not going to showcase Buffy Saint Marie anymore because I honestly don't know who she is, which is very sad to me. And now she was born in 1941. That makes her 84 years old now. So I don't know what the real story is. I know that she was an inspiration to me, and she gave me something that I made use of in the time that I got them. So I want to honor that and also point to whatever it was in her that made her need to create this sort of false self that she put out into the world. I'd like to understand more about that. And any of us who have that impulse or that contradiction or that conflict about wanting to be seen and wanting to be seen maybe in an exaggerated way, that does make sense. Certainly for us, after being invisible and after having so much experience of feeling like there is no me, which is so much the experience of neglect. So this is not nothing. And so I invite you to think about these confusing ideas with me as we observe in whatever way we might the indigenous peoples of whatever country we live in. And some countries are much more gracious and honoring and really, integrating with the people that originated there. And some of us have really shameful, despicable histories. And I just want to, in any way we can, do whatever repair we can. So I thank you all for listening, and whatever day it is in your country and wherever you are, I wish you a gentle day, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.